Your directions are to title each section that we go over. I want neat and organized notes or bullet points for each section to help whenever we come back to school. The British system of government. The Magna Carta had placed limits on the power of the monarch in 1215. England's lawmaking body, Parliament, emerged as a force that the king had to depend on to pay for wars and to finance the royal government. Like Parliament, the colonial assemblies controlled the colony's funds. For that reason, the assemblies had some control over colonial governors. The Magna Carta was an influence of our Constitution. I'd write that down. The English Bill of Rights in 1689 provided another important model for Americans. Many Americans felt that the Constitution also needed a Bill of Rights. Write that down. Framers of the Constitution got many ideas on the nature of people and government from European writers of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a movement of the 1700s that promoted knowledge, reason, and science as the means to improve society. James Madison and other architects of the Constitution were familiar with the work of John Locke and Baron de Montesquieu, two important philosophers. Locke, an English philosopher, believed that all people have natural rights. These natural rights include the rights to life, liberty, and property. In his two treatises of civil government, he wrote that government is based on an agreement or contract between the people and the ruler. Many Americans interpreted natural rights to mean the rights of Englishmen defined in the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. The framers viewed the Constitution as a contract between the American people and the government. The contract protected the people's natural rights by limiting the government's power. I hope to see words in your notes about limiting and natural rights and enlightenment. That's what I hope to see. The federal system. The Constitution created a federal system of government that divided powers between the national or federal government and the states. That's your definition of federalism. Write that down. The Constitution created a federal system of government. Federalism is dividing the power between the federal or central government and the states. Under the Articles of Confederation, the states retain their sovereignty or freedom. Under the Constitution, the states gave up some of their powers to the federal government while keeping others. So under a system of federalism, the national or federal government, the central government, is stronger than the states. States gave up some of their rights. Hope to see that in your notes. Shared powers. Federalism, or sharing powers between the federal and state governments, is one of the distinctive features of the United States government. Under the Constitution, the federal government gained broad powers to tax, regulate trade, control the currency, raise an army, and declare war. It could also pass laws that were necessary and proper for carrying out its responsibilities. Write those powers down under the powers of the Constitution. However, the Constitution left important powers in the hands of the states. The states had the power to, go ahead and write these down under states, pass and enforce laws and regulate trade within their borders. They could also establish local governments, schools, and other institutions affecting the welfare of their citizens. We see the job of the government is to provide for the people, meet the people's needs. Both federal and state governments also had the power to tax and build roads. Write those powers down. It's good stuff. The Constitution becomes supreme law of the land. The Constitution and the laws that Congress passed were to be the supreme law of the land. No state could make laws or actions that went against the Constitution. Any dispute between the federal government and the states was to be settled by the federal courts on the basis of the Constitution. Under the new federal system, the Constitution became the final and supreme authority. So it seems to me like the federal government is stronger than the states, and the federal government and the Supreme Court has the final word. Write those things down and put them in your notes. All right, now we're jumping to the organization of government, and we're going to start with the legislative branch. Article 1 of the Constitution established Congress, the legislative branch or lawmaking branch of the government. Congress is composed of the House of Representatives and the Senate. As a result of the Great Compromise between large states and small states, each state's representation in the House is proportional to its population. Representation in the Senate is equal, 2 senators for each state. The powers of Congress include taxes, coining money, and regulating trade. Congress can also declare war and raise and support armies. Finally, it makes all laws needed to fulfill functions to it as stated in the Constitution. For this section, Article 1 equals the legislative branch, the lawmaking branch. Go ahead and list the powers. The executive branch. Memories of King George III's rule made some delegates reluctant to establish a powerful executive or a ruler. Note, Articles of Confederation, no executive branch. The New Jersey Plan, you had those small states that wanted to divide the executive branch into three people. Others believed that the Confederation had failed in part because it lacked an executive branch or president. They argued that a strong executive would serve as a check or limit on Congress. Article 2 of the Constitution established the executive branch headed by the president to carry out the nation's laws and policies. Executive branch headed by the president, and his job is to execute or enforce, carry out the nation's laws. The president serves as commander-in-chief of the armed forces and conducts relations with foreign countries. The president and vice president are elected by a special group called the Electoral College, made up of presidential electors. Each state's voters select electors to cast their votes for the president and vice president. Each state has as many electors as it has senators and representatives in Congress. The president and vice president chosen by the electors serve a 4-year term. The judicial branch. Article 3 of the Constitution deals with the judicial branch or court system of the United States. The nation's judicial power resides in one Supreme Court and any other lower federal courts that Congress might establish. Okay? Judicial branch establishes the federal court system. The Supreme Court and the federal courts hear cases involving the Constitution, laws passed by Congress, and disputes between states. System of checks and balances. The most distinctive feature of the United States government is the separation of powers, meaning 3 branches. The Constitution divides the government power among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. To keep any one branch from gaining too much power, the framers built in a system of checks and balances. These 3 branches of government have roles that check or limit the others so that no single branch can dominate the government. Both the House and the Senate must pass a bill for it to become a law. The president can check Congress by vetoing or rejecting the bill. However, Congress can then check the president by overriding or voting down the veto. To override a veto, 2/3 of the members of both houses of Congress must vote for the bill. The system of checks and balances also applies to the Supreme Court. The president appoints Supreme Court justices, and the Senate must approve the appointments. There's a whole lot of examples of checks and balances in there to include vetoes and what's called congressional override. Go ahead and put those in your notes under system of checks and balances. The whole idea is to prevent one branch from becoming too powerful. Okay, now we're going to jump down to the constitutional debate. Okay, the Constitution met a lot of resistance, and we'll start to see why. The delegates at Philadelphia had produced the Constitution, but its acceptance depended upon the will of the people. Gaining approval of the Constitution with its radical new plan of government was not going to be easy. Supporters and opponents prepared to defend their positions. Before the Constitution could go into effect, 9 states needed to ratify or approve it. State legislatures set up specific ratifying conventions to consider the document. By late 1787, these conventions started to meet. Rhode Island stood apart. Its leaders opposed the Constitution from the beginning and therefore did not call a convention to approve it. The great debate now took place throughout the country. In newspapers, at public meetings, and in ordinary conversations, Americans discussed the arguments for and against the new Constitution. So the last section was on this constitutional debate. We're going to see the 2 sides appear here in the next couple sections. The 2 sides are the Federalists, those that support federalism, and the Anti-Federalists, those that are against federalism or against a strong national government. Federalists. Supporters of the new Constitution were called Federalists. Better organized than their opponents, Federalists enjoyed the support of 2 of the most respected men in America, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Three of the nation's most gifted political thinkers, James Madison of Virginia, Alexander Hamilton of New York, and John Jay, also backed the Constitution. Madison, Hamilton, and Jay teamed up to write a series of essays explaining and defending the Constitution. These essays appeared in newspapers around the country and were widely read by Americans of every persuasion. Called the Federalist Papers, they were later published as a book and sent to debates at remaining ratifying conventions. Jefferson described the series of essays as the best commentary on the principles of government which was ever written. The Anti-Federalists called those who opposed ratification Anti-Federalists. Although not as well organized as the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists had some dedicated supporters. They responded to the Federalists with a series of their own essays known as the Anti-Federalist Papers. Their main argument was that the new Constitution would take away the liberties Americans had fought to win from Great Britain. The Constitution would create a strong central government, ignore the will of the states and the people, and favor the wealthy few over the common people. Anti-Federalists preferred local government close to the people. An energetic central government, they feared, would be government by a small, educated group of individuals. They agreed with Patrick Henry, who warned that the Constitution was incompatible with the genius of republicanism. So these people of group known as the Anti-Federalists were fearful of a strong government that was created by the Constitution. They thought that the people's will would be ignored with such a strong government. Put that in your notes. Perhaps the strongest criticism of the Constitution was that it lacked a Bill of Rights to protect individual freedoms. Anti-Federalists believed that no government could be trusted to protect the freedom of its citizens. Several states' conventions took a stand and announced that they would not ratify or approve the Constitution without the addition of a Bill of Rights. Mercy Otis Warren, a Massachusetts opponent of the Constitution, expressed the problem faced by many Anti-Federalists. She admitted the need for a strong government, but feared it. We have struggled for liberty and made costly sacrifices, and there are still many among us who value liberty too much to relinquish the rights of man for the dignity of government. In many ways, the debate between Federalists and Anti-Federalists came down to different fears. Federalists feared disorder without a strong central government. Think about Shays' Rebellion. Disorder without a strong government. They believed that more uprisings like Shays' Rebellion would occur. They looked to the Constitution to create a national government capable of maintaining order. The Anti-Federalists feared oppression more than disorder. They still fear that tyrant, that King George, the abusive government that they had under England. They worried about the concentration of power that would result from a strong national government. Make sure you have their different fears in your section notes about protecting rights. Adopting the Constitution. On December 7, 1787, Delaware became the first state to approve the Constitution. On June 21, 1788, the ninth state, New Hampshire, ratified it. In theory, that meant that the new government could go into effect. However, without the support of two large states, New York and Virginia, the future of the new government was not promising. Neither state had ratified it yet, and both had strong anti-federalist groups. Remember, those people wanting a Bill of Rights. In Virginia, Patrick Henry gave fiery speeches against the proposed Constitution. It did not, he charged, sufficiently limit the power of the federal government. Enlightenment ideas, Magna Carta, limited government. He didn't think that the Constitution went far enough to protect people from abusive government. Still, Virginia ratified the Constitution at the end of June 1788 after being assured that the Constitution would include a Bill of Rights amendment. An amendment is something added to a document. These amendments would protect people from the government. That left three states, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island, to ratify. In July 1788, New York finally ratified it by a narrow margin. North Carolina ratified it November 1789, and Rhode Island ratified on May 1790. After ratification came the celebrations. Boston, New York, and Philadelphia held big parades accompanied by cannon salutes and ringing church bells. Smaller celebrations took place in hundreds of American towns. The task of creating the Constitution had ended. The Bill of Rights would be added in 1791 after the new government took office. Now it was time for the nation to elect leaders and begin the work of government.